Divers have made quite a discovery off Nantucket Island in Massachusetts, the wreck of a German U-boat. A team of divers spent decades searching for it, and using sonar, they finally found the sub this week.
60 miles off the coast of New Jersey, divers discovered a complete German U-boat sitting upright on the ocean floor. No records, no identification, and no clear explanation for how it ended up there. Two divers would lose their lives trying to uncover the truth, and what was eventually pulled from inside rewrote a piece of World War II history that had been wrong for 50 years. What do you think was really inside that U-boat? Drop your theory in the comments. We're diving into every detail so you don't miss what they found. Something was on the ocean floor. It began with a fishing captain and a sonar reading he could not explain. The object appeared again and again at the same coordinates. Trip after trip, resting about 230 feet below the surface, roughly 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey. It was too large to be debris and too stationary to be a school of fish. Curious but uncertain, the captain noted the location and eventually passed it, along to a wreck diver named Bill Nagel, almost casually, as if mentioning something that might or might not matter. To Nagel, it mattered. In September 1991, he assembled a team and set out to investigate. A dive to that depth is far from routine. At 230 feet, nitrogen narcosis becomes a serious concern. The condition affects the brain in ways similar to intoxication, dulling judgment, and distorting perception. Decisions that would seem reckless on the surface can feel entirely reasonable underwater. Combined with cold temperatures, limited visibility, and the immense pressure of the surrounding ocean, the dive left little room for error. When Nagel's team descended, their lights cut through near total darkness. Then one beam struck something solid and enormous. What emerged from the gloom was a submarine. It stood upright on the ocean floor, intact and eerily undisturbed, as though it had been placed there deliberately. This alone was strange. Submarines, lost in combat, typically leave debris fields with wreckage scattered outward. Here there was nothing of the sort, just the vessel, whole and silent. As the divers moved closer, the details became even more unsettling. The hull had been torn open, but the damage was not random. It had a distinct pattern, one the team immediately noticed, though they could not yet interpret it. Near the breach, human bones were visible. Even more disturbing, every identifying mark on the submarine had been removed. No numbers, no nameplate, nothing that could tie it to any official record. When the discovery was reported, the official response was firm. No German submarine had ever been lost in that area. Yet the evidence on the ocean floor contradicted that claim. The wreck was real. The remains were real. Somewhere, history had a gap, one that had gone unnoticed for decades. Identifying the submarine would not be easy. With no markings, the investigation would depend on design details, structural features, and forensic analysis of the remains. The dive itself had lasted less than an hour, but the mystery it uncovered would take years to unravel. The dive that cost everything. Word moved through the East Coast diving community the way word always moves in tight communities where everyone knows everyone and where an unsolved mystery with physical access is the most compelling thing imaginable. A nameless German U-boat sitting intact at 230 feet off New Jersey with human remains visible and every identification mark removed was not the kind of discovery that stayed quiet for long. Chris Rouse and his 22-year-old son Chrissy were among the divers drawn to the wreck. They were known in that community as a genuinely exceptional team, experienced beyond what their years might suggest. Close in the particular way that people become close when they share a physically demanding and genuinely dangerous pursuit over a long period of time. When they arrived on deck on October 12, 1992, both of them felt something that experienced divers recognize and rarely dismiss. The sea looked wrong, dark and unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with weather forecasts. They went down anyway. The depth required a gas mixture called trimix, which supplements standard compressed air with helium to reduce the narcosis effect at depth and manage the physiological stress on the body during a long dive. Trimix was expensive. The Rouses could not afford it that day. They descended 230 feet on standard gas, which meant they were operating with the full cognitive impairment that depth and nitrogen together produce, with a narrower margin for error than the dive demanded, and with a more aggressive decompression requirement on the way back up. Chrissy went into the wreck interior following a guideline he had set toward the galley. In the darkness and confined space of a submarine that had been sitting on the ocean floor for 50 years, he found a German artifact and began working to retrieve it. Beneath the artifact was a folded rubber life raft, the kind of emergency equipment stored in specific locations throughout the vessel. He moved it to get better access to what he had found. The raft shifted. Corroded structures that had been resting against each other in a fragile equilibrium for half a century came loose and collapsed. Chrissy was pinned to the floor of the submarine in total darkness, 230 feet underwater, with the silt that had accumulated across decades now suspended in the water around him, reducing visibility to nothing. His father, waiting outside, noticed that the guideline connecting him to his son had gone still. He went in. In the darkness and the silt and the confined space, he tore at the wreckage with his hands until his son was free. They had been at depth for 31 minutes beyond the safe bottom, time their gas mixture allowed. Every additional minute at that depth without beginning the decompression process increases the danger of decompression sickness on ascent, and 31 minutes past the limit is not a small number. Chrissy's regulator took in water during the scramble out. The panic that followed was the kind that cannot be reasoned with at 230 feet, with nitrogen affecting every thought. He ascended. Not slowly, with the controlled stops that allow nitrogen to leave the body at a rate the body can manage. He went straight up from 230 feet to the surface without stopping. Chris Rouse had 3 seconds to make a decision: ascend slowly and survive alone, or follow his son. He followed his son. Nitrogen that has dissolved into body tissue under pressure does not stay dissolved when pressure drops suddenly. It comes out of solution the way carbonation comes out of a shaken bottle when the cap is opened. In joints, in the spinal cord, in the brain, nitrogen expanding rapidly causes damage that ranges from severe pain to paralysis to death. And it does it fast. Both Rouses surfaced with the full effect of zero-stop ascent from 230 feet working through their bodies simultaneously. Chris died on the deck of the boat before any help could reach him. Chrissy was airlifted to a hyperbaric chamber where pressure could be used to force the nitrogen back into solution and then allow it to leave the body at a survivable rate. In the chamber, before his heart stopped, he told the doctors attending him that he had heard jungle drums and believed something was coming for him. The nitrogen had been inside his brain long enough and at sufficient concentration to completely detach his perception from reality. His heart stopped shortly after. Both father and son were gone. The submarine still had no name. It had now claimed 2 lives of people trying to find one. What the wreck was hiding, the team went back. The mindset was different after the Rouses died. The awareness of what the wreck was capable of extracting in exchange for its secrets was no longer theoretical. But the divers went back because the questions the wreck was generating had not become smaller with the deaths. If anything, they had become more pressing. What they found inside the control room on subsequent dives was not what flooding looks like. Flooding kills crews in predictable ways, in predictable locations. Sailors move toward escape routes. Bodies end up near hatches, near ladders, near any path toward the surface or toward its sealed compartments that might hold air. The bones inside the control room of this submarine were not distributed that way. They were scattered with a violence that suggested not flooding but force. Skulls were wedged into steel structures. Bones had been thrown into corners with enough energy to lodge them there. Something had moved these men with tremendous force at the moment they died. The equipment told a similar story. Heavy machinery ripped from its mountings, control panels bent inward, the kind of damage produced not by water pressure from outside, working slowly against the hull, but by a sudden, massive release of energy from within the space itself. The geometry of the damage pointed inward consistently, from the interior surfaces outward, which is the opposite of what external water pressure produces. The hull breach, re-examined with this context, resolved into something specific. The steel around the breach was bent inward, concentrated in a single location rather than distributed across the hull the way depth charge damage distributes. Depth charges work by pressure wave across a surface area. They crush from outside. This breach had come from a direct strike at a specific point. The pattern matched one weapon type from the Second World War arsenal, a torpedo. No Allied ship had ever reported firing a torpedo in that area. The official record for that entire stretch of coastline in that period of the war contained no entry that would account for a torpedo strike at those coordinates. Whatever had hit this submarine had done so without leaving a trace in any document that had survived or been made available. That silence in the record was itself a data point, and it pointed toward something that the investigation would take several more years to fully assemble. The knife with a dead man's name. John Chatterton was the diver who refused to let the identification question go. He returned to the wreck year after year alongside fellow diver Richie Kohler. Each dive another attempt to find the single piece of physical evidence that would connect the vessel to a name in the German naval records. In November 1991, Chatterton opened a drawer inside the wreck and found a stainless steel dinner knife. Unremarkable in itself. But on the wooden handle, hand-carved by whoever had owned it, was a name, Hurenberg. German naval archives confirmed a Martin Hurenberg in their records. He had served on a submarine designated U-869. The records for U-869 stated that it had been sunk near Gibraltar in the waters off the coast of Spain, thousands of miles from New Jersey. Historians who were consulted on the knife explanation pointed at the gap between the two locations and suggested Hurenberg must have transferred to another submarine before U-869's final mission. The knife was interesting but not conclusive. Chatterton kept diving. 3 more years passed. Dozens more dives. The wreck gave up information slowly and at considerable physical cost to everyone attempting to extract it. Then, on August 31, 1997, in the electric motor room buried in accumulated silt that had to be carefully cleared away, Chatterton found a small wooden box. Inside it was a plastic identification tag. 3 inches of plastic. 4 stamped characters, U-869, 6 years from the first descent. 2 deaths. Dozens of dives deep enough to impair judgment and exact physiological cost from every person who made them. The mystery of the submarine's identity was resolved by a piece of plastic smaller than a playing card. The records that had placed U-869's destruction near Gibraltar were wrong. The submarine had never made it to Gibraltar. It had died off the American coast and sat there, unaccounted for in any official record, for more than 50 years. The historical record had been wrong for half a century, and the correction had required 6 years of work at 230 feet to produce. The Man Who Almost Sailed. In 1999, a German documentary aired about the discovery and identification of U-869. A 78-year-old man named Herbert Guskey watched it alone. Guskey was the sole surviving member of U-869's crew. He had collapsed with double pneumonia in the days immediately before the submarine's final mission. The vessel had sailed without him, and for 54 years he had not known where his crewmates had gone or how they had died. The uncertainty that kind of not knowing produces across 5 decades is not something that resolves on its own. It sits. He watched the documentary. He watched divers descend to the wreck and move through the interior he had trained to operate in. When the knife appeared on screen, he recognized the name immediately. Martin Hurenberg had worked alongside Guskey in the radio room. He knew the handwriting. He knew the man who had carved his name into the handle of a dinner knife and carried it aboard a submarine that would never come back. Hurenberg had a daughter. She had been an infant when U-869 sailed on its final mission, young enough that she had no memory of her father and had grown up with absence where a father should have been, not knowing until she was 18 years old that he had died, and not knowing for the rest of her life where or how until Richie Kohler tracked her down. Kohler placed the knife in her hands. The object her father had made, carried and died with, recovered from 230 feet of cold Atlantic water after 50 years on the ocean floor, was now in the hands of the daughter he had never seen grow up. There is no clean way to describe what that moment represents. It is the kind of thing that the 6 years, and the 2 deaths, and the dozens of dangerous dives were ultimately in service of, even if none of the people making those dives could have known that at the start. The weapon that came back. Chatterton and Kohler took the damage evidence to naval weapons experts. The specific pattern of the hull breach, the inward concentration of the strike, the absence of any Allied record of a torpedo fired in that area, All of it went to people whose professional knowledge of Second World War naval weapons was detailed enough to produce a specific answer. Germany had developed a torpedo designated the T5, known by the name Zaunkönig, which translates roughly as Wren. It was an acoustic homing weapon, meaning it did not travel in a straight line toward a fixed target. It tracked engine noise. It adjusted its course in response to the sound of running machinery. The concept was genuinely revolutionary for its time. A torpedo that could hunt, that could correct for a moving target, that could not simply be outrun by a ship changing course, represented a significant advance over the fixed trajectory weapons that both sides had been using throughout the war. Its catastrophic flaw was built into the same mechanism that made it revolutionary. If the T5 lost lock on its intended target, it did not simply run out of range and sink. It continued searching for the loudest available sound source. And the loudest available sound source, once the target had escaped or been destroyed, was often the submarine that had fired it. The weapon that could not be outrun could also not be outrun by the vessel that launched it. The precedent was documented. On October 24, 1944, the American submarine USS Tang fired a T5 equivalent during a surface engagement. The torpedo ran its course, lost its target lock, and turned back. The crew of the Tang had 20 seconds between the moment they saw it turn and the moment it hit them. 20 seconds to watch the weapon they had built, loaded, aimed, and fired complete its arc and come back. The expert verdict on U-869 was consistent with this pattern. The submarine had almost certainly fired a T5, watched it leave the tube, and had no warning before impact. The weapon's acoustic guidance would have made the return approach indistinguishable from the torpedo's departure until the moment of impact. There would have been no time to identify what was happening, no time to take any action, and no external enemy vessel involved at any point in the sequence. They built the weapon, they loaded it, they fired it, and then it came home. The part that is hardest to sit with. The torpedo struck the control room. The force of the impact was concentrated enough and sudden enough to scatter the men in that compartment with the violence that the divers had found in the bones, wedged into steel and thrown into corners. The control room crew died in the first seconds, but the submarine was built with watertight doors between compartments. The rear sections of the vessel, the engine room, the aft quarters, the rear torpedo room were sealed by those doors when the impact came. The doors held. The men in those sections were not killed by the initial strike. They felt the shockwave before they understood what had produced it. They felt the deck tilt, the nose going down, the angle that every sailor on a submarine recognizes as the angle that means the vessel is going to the bottom. There was no possibility of rescue at 230 feet. Escape at that depth without equipment means instant death. The sealed air in the rear compartments could last hours. Some of those men, in the hours after the torpedo that their own vessel had fired, came back and killed their crewmates in the control room, sat in sealed compartments in total darkness at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey, and waited for what was coming. They knew what was coming. Every one of them knew exactly what the angle of the deck and the silence from the control room and the pressure building against the hull meant. They had trained for every scenario that submarine warfare produced. They knew this one. That knowledge, held in a sealed compartment in the dark with the ocean pressing against the hull from every direction, is the part of the U-869 story that does not resolve into historical narrative or engineering analysis or archival correction. It just sits there, the same way the submarine sits on the ocean floor, unchanged by the passage of time. U-869 is still there, 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey, sitting upright on the sand at 230 feet, the crew still inside. The hull corrodes at the rate that steel corrodes in cold salt water, slowly but without stopping, year by year losing structural integrity in increments too small to observe on any individual dive but real across the decades. At some point, the hull will collapse. The structure that has held its shape since 1945 will finally give way, and when it does, there will be no grave marker, no ceremony, no formal acknowledgement of the 60 men inside it. Just the cold Atlantic settling over what remains the way it has been settling over them for 80 years, patient and indifferent, and completely without memory of what it covers. The historical record has been corrected. The name is known, the weapon that killed the crew has been identified, the daughter has the knife. Herbert Gusky, who survived because he fell ill at the right moment, lived long enough to learn where his crewmates died. The pieces of the story that could be recovered have been recovered, at significant cost, by people who decided that the cost was worth paying. The pieces that cannot be recovered stay with the wreck. What was said in those sealed rear compartments in the hours after the torpedo struck? What was thought? What was written, if anything was written? What it sounded like when the ocean finally came in? Those pieces are 60 miles offshore and 230 feet down, and they are staying there. A complete submarine with no name, sitting upright on the ocean floor for 50 years. 2 divers dead, a knife with a carved name, a daughter who grew up without a father, a torpedo that turned around. The answers were all there, waiting in the dark at 230 feet. It took 6 years and 2 lives to bring them up. Subscribe so you never miss the next one.